We're learning the second Sikha of Parshas Behar in Chelek Chav Beis on page 150. The shir today is being learned Lil Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. In Heintige Sedre sagt the Torah, in this week's Parsha, the Torah tells us, as a Yid was hat sich verkauft als Evet zu a zweiten Yiden, that if one Jew sells himself as a slave to another, is when es kommt Shnas HaYovel, when the year of Yovel arrives, that's the 50th year, when all slaves go free, is v'yotza me'imach, so the slave goes out free from you, hu ubanav imai, he and his sons along with him. Stellt sich Rashi auf hu ubanav imai. So Rashi quotes the words of the pasuk hu ubanav imai in his mefarish and explains as follows. Omer Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon said, Im hu nimkar banav mi machran. If the Evet himself was sold, who sold his sons? Why is it saying that his sons go free? Ella mikan. So from here, from the language of the pasuk, we learn Rabbi chayev v'mezainis banov, that the master is obligated to feed his sons along with the servant himself or the slave himself. So when he goes free, it's the children that are not going free along with him. That's Rashi. Now the question on this Rashi is as follows: the shaila in pasuk is doch blois banov mi machran. The question on the pasuk here is the sons. Who sold the sons? Why does Rashi have to give the introduction by saying if he was sold, then who sold the sons? Those words are completely extra. The fact that he sold is obvious. Afapi, as das is the lashon from Rab Shimon, even though this is a quote and this is the language that Rab Shimon says in the Gemara, is aber vigeret kama pamim, as already said many times, nit nyoni von Rashi bepirusha la teire zu meitig sein droshes razal b'lashoina. Rashi's purpose is not to quote the statements that Chazal say on the Psukim verbatim. Und the far is a oft mal mishana, therefore many times, often, Rashi switches, upshite, mashmit, umekatze, and definitely Rashi many times omits or shortens from Lashon Razal of the language that the Razal tell us, whether in Gemara or elsewhere. Behesim zum Pirish HaKasav al pipshutish mikra. And Rashi only brings what's needed for the simple pshat of the pasuk to explain the pshutish mikra. The Tmiyah in them is noch starker, the questioner is even stronger. In the Parsha from Eved Ivri in Parshas Mishpatim. Earlier in Parshas Mishpatim, where the Torah discusses many of the halachas of a slave, a Jewish slave, state, so there the pasuk says, in Baal Ishahu, if he's a husband and he has a wife, then v'yatze ishtoi imai. When he leaves his master, his wife goes free with him. On Rashi is mefarish. So there Rashi explains, and then on the words v'yatza ishtoi imai, that his wife goes free with him, v'chi miach nisa sheteitze. Who brought her in to the master that she now goes out free? It's only her husband that's the slave, not the wife. Elo magad hakosov, the pasuk here is teaching sha'akayin chulu, one that buys a slave, chayev b'mezainis chulu, he's obligated to feed the wife as well. That's what Rashi says there. Now, if we compare the way Rashi asks the question there regarding the wife and what Rashi says here when Rashi asks the question regarding the son, so we could see the difference here. Zetmen dort. So we see there as Rashi zaktak in the akdame im hu nimka. There Rashi does not start with the introduction if he is sold. Why is his wife sold? Rashi doesn't bring that those first three words. Rashi simply asks regarding his wife, who brought her into the slavery? Is a so why here in our parsha, when Rashi is addressing what it says here, that the sons go out, so why does Rashi begin with the introduction, if he is sold, who sold the children? Those three words, emunimka, are extra. The Pella is noch gresse, the wonder on Rashi's language here is even greater. The Mokker from Maimer Hashimim, Rav Rashi bringt with Parshasenu in Gemara. The source of what Rashi says here is in the Gemara. Und dorten bringt sich, as Rab Shimon hat euch gedarschen, den pasuk from Mishpatim, v'yatze ishte imai. And the Gemara there brings that Rab Shimon also expounded the pasuk quoted before in Parshas Mishpatim, where it says that the wife goes out with him, in demselben Signen. And there, Rab Shimon actually asks the question in the same words, the way Rashi brings it here. Rab Shimon says on that pasuk, Im hu nimkar, if the slave himself is sold, Ishtoi mi nimkara, who sold the wife? From here we learn that it's the master that's obligated to feed her. So there, in the Gemara, the same expression of imhu nimkar is said both regarding the pasuk in our parsha, regarding the sons, and regarding the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, regarding the wife. Und von deswegen, but nevertheless, is dort Rashi nit meitig dem Loshon von Maimer Rab Shimon imhu nimkar cholo. But there, in Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi does not quote the language that Rab Shimon says, including these words, Imu Nimka. Now, bringt from Mechilte, he just quotes a different expression, which is not in the Gemara, rather it's in the Mechilte, and that is, V'chi mi hichnisa sheteitze. Who brought her in to the master that now she's going out? Unbenidden lidan. Whereas here, regarding the pasuk in our parsha, the who banavimai, Rashi bringt the Lashon from Rab Shimon. He brings the expression that Rab Shimon says in the Gemara in Kedushin, the exact language over here, imhu nimkar. Why does Rashi bring that expression here? Nachmer, furthermore, the question is, Oich was Rashi bringt die Wörter, Banav mi machran. When Rashi brings and asks the question, who sold the sons? Isn't verstandig, and this itself it's also not understood why Rashi has to add and question this, who sold the sons into slavery. In Teres Kainim da, in the Teres Kainim here on the pasuk, bringt sich lachatchile the limit from pasuk. He just explains right away the meaning of the pasuk without first asking any questions, and it simply says Rabbi chayev v'mezaynis banav. The master is obligated to feed the sons as well. On the Ragdamas Hashayla, without first prefacing the question, banav mi machran, who sold the sons into slavery. Rashi, so if so, Rashi as well, was dar is it's Rashi's style that he wrote his interpretations of the psukim, his commentary on the psukim. Is nit zu maktem sein de Shaila in pasuk und danach geben der teretz. Rashi doesn't usually first say what his question is on the pasuk and then give the answer. Nor zu sagen lachatchile blois der pirush in pasuk. Rashi just comes immediately and tells you what the correct shot of the pasuk is. Avade gedaft doneben mit dem Pirish, so definitely Rashi should have began right in the beginning. Mikan sharabi chayev v'mezaynis banav. That from here we learn that the master is obligated to feed the sons as well. Nit zu makdim zayin de shaila banav mi machran, without prefacing the question, who sold the sons into slavery. So now we see that in the words of Rashi here, when it says imu nimkar, that's definitely extra. And as we can see from Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim, when he doesn't say this kind of expression. And even when Rashi says, Banav mi machran, this is also extra. Rashi could have just simply said that Rabbi Chayiv Mezaynis Banav, as it says it in the Teres Kainim. So at first glance, we would explain the difference of the way Rashi says it in Mishpatim and the way Rashi explains it here, as das ist tali in the Shinui Aloshin in the Tzvei Psukim. This depends on the language of the Psukim themselves, which are not the same. In unser Pasuk steht, Hu ubana vimai. Here in our Pasuk it says, after it says, V'yatzei mimach, the Pasuk adds, he and his sons leave from you. The Rebbe, Retoich Rashi, wegen them, therefore Rashi addresses this as well, and he says, Imhu nimka, if he was sold, banav mimachna, who sold the sons? So Rashi is using this expression based on the language of the Pasuk here. Mashenken in Parshas Mishpatim, steht blois, V'yatza ishta yimai. In Parshas Mishpatim, the pasuk only says that the wife goes out with him on the vart hu, and the Torah does not say the word hu, that it's he and his wife together. So there, since the pasuk itself only speaks about the fact that the wife was together with him in slavery, so therefore Rashi also only addresses the wife who brought her into the slavery. Aber der Hesber is klar maspik. This explanation for the difference of Rashi in Mishpatim and Rashi in our Parsha is not at all sufficient. Warum Rashi hat geschrieben Pirushi ala Teire betachlis hadik va kitzer. Rashi wrote his commentary on the Teire with very precise and very short, not any extra words. Rashi doesn't use any extra expressions or in words that are connected to other ideas that he brings it in because of some kind of similarity in the language of speech or writing. Rashi doesn't do that. He just writes very short exactly what the point is, straight to the point. So if, when it says imhu nimkar, this is not coming to explain the word hu in the pasuk, v'steht in pasuk. It's only just an introduction to the question of who sold the children. is mimanavshach. So therefore the question still remains that either way, there's no reason for Rashi to add im hu nimkar. Oy the shaila banav mimachron fadatag dame im hu nimkar. If the question of who sold the sons, you need this introduction of im hu nimkar. If he was sold, what Rashi gedav zogen de agdame oich bepirushay in Parshas Mishpatim. So then Rashi should say this introduction also in Parshas Mishpatim as well. And oy the shaila fadat niti agdame. And if this question does not demand this introduction, was the far brengt es net Rashi be Parshas Mishpatim, and therefore in Parshas Mishpatim he does not give this introduction. Favos brengt es be Parshas Seinu. So why here in our parsha does Rashi bring the introduction of this question im hu nimkar? So Moz men sagen. Conclusion that we reach from this question in the language of Rashi is as follows: As es da shinu in teichen zwischen die zwei psukim. There's a difference in the content of the psukim in Mishpatim and here. Was the far vet euch recht werden was, and therefore this will also explain why Aleph in Parshas Mishpatim bringt Rashi nit Maimer Rab Shimon. In Parshas Mishpatim Rashi does not quote the statement of Rab Shimon from the Gemara, nor from Mechilta. Rather he quotes from the language of the Mechilta. On the Parshas Seinu is Masim Dafke Maimer Rab Shimon. Based on the language of the pasuk in our parsha, it's appropriate to quote what Rab Shimon said in the Gemara. And there is another point. The Parshas Seinu is Rashi Maitik Oich Dem Shem Balamayim Rab Shimon. In our parsha, when Rashi quotes from the Gemara, he also quotes by name Rab Shimon that said this. Mashenkin in Parshas Mishpatim bringt nit Rashi Dem Shem Balamayim da Mechilta. Rashi does not quote the name that says in the Mechilta, the one that said the statement, which is Rabbi Yitzchak. So because this is based on the difference in the context of the psukim, the language of the psukim of Mishpatim, and here there's a difference in how Rashi asks the question and how Rashi addresses what it says in our parsha, who sold the sons, and what it says in Parshas Mishpatim, who sold the wife together with the slave. Now to further analyze what it says in Rashi Parshas Mishpatim, noch hatmiyah in die zwei Pirushei Rashi, comparing what it says in Rashi Parshas Mishpatim to what Rashi says here. In Parshas Mishpatim, sagt Rashi, Magid HaKosov, Chayev b'mezonis ishtoi bonov. That from the words of the psukim in Parshas Mishpatim, where the pasuk there says, V'yotza ishtoi imai, we learn that the master is obligated to feed his wife and the children. So Rashi mentions there the children as well. Chach in pasuk verem bonov nitamont. Even though there in Parshas Mishpatim, the children are not mentioned. So where does Rashi take this from? So the Mefarshim explain, as those was Rashi's Meisav Banov, the fact that Rashi there adds the children as well, maintenance to Zogin as Malentes up from the Pasuk V'yatzei Shtei Imai. Rashi's intention is not to say that we understand it from what the Pasuk says there, that the wife was sold with him and she now goes free. Varom, since Ka'omar, as explained, the Pasuk ret nor wegen Nishtei. There the Pasuk only mentions his wife. Kemen von dem nicht wissen dem din bezoines Banov. So you can't learn and compare that the same would apply to the children as well, that the master has to feed them. Und wie steht in Gemara, and as it says in the Gemara, is nachmer that you actually have a certain a reason why the obligation to feed the wife would not apply to the sons. Al pisvara yeshleima, because logically you could say, as dafke ishtoi, it's only his wife, was yishemtzach, l'chazar al apsachim, she's embarrassed to go and collect money for herself at the homes, at the doors of the homes, is Rabbi Chayvim Zainisel. So the husband must feed her. But it doesn't necessarily apply to the sons that can go and collect money for themselves. So where is Rashi taking what he adds in Parshas Mishpatim, that the master is obligated to feed the wife and the children? So the commentaries say that since Rashi is mentioning the fact that the master has to feed his wife, so along with this, he brings also the fact that he's supposed to feed the children as well, even though there's no source there in Mishpatim. And Rashi is relying on the source, which is the pasuk in our parsha. As the Mechilta says in Parshas Mishpatim, the master has to feed the wife and the children. Shenemar, and the Mechilta quotes the source from our parsha, that when he leaves, his children are leaving with him, which indicates that the master was obligated to feed the children. That's why Rashi there adds the children as well. To say that this is the basis of Rashi, the pasuk in our parsha, is very difficult to accept. While for the following reasons. Besides the fact, similar to what Rashi does in Mishpatim, that while he's mentioning that the master has to feed the wife, he also mentions the fact that he has to feed the children. So in our parsha, when he mentions the fact that the master has to feed the children, he should bring also that he feeds the wife. And as it is in the Teres Kainim in our parsha, just like the master has to feed the slave himself, so too is chayiv to feed the wife and the children. So the Teres Kainim in our parsha includes the wife, even though it doesn't say her explicitly in the pasuk. So why wouldn't Rashi do here similar to what he himself does in Parshas Mishpatim? Besides this, the question is as mezoin is bonov, lernt man up von an ander pasuk, if the mechilte in Parshas Mishpatim has to bring a special source from the pasuk in our parsha that the master feeds not only the wife but also the children. Hat doch Rashi, was is mefarish, pshute shel mikra, on euch fara ben chamesh, ziche gedaft azeitan. If so, Rashi, that explains the simple pshat of the pasuk, and he's explaining it for a child, a 5-year-old, would definitely have to bring a source for the addition that he adds there that the master has to feed not only the wife, also the children. So how can you say that Rashi there is relying on a pasuk here in Parshas Behar that the child didn't learn yet? If even the Mechilta brings the pasuk of our parsha, definitely Rashi should. Moz men zogin. So therefore we must say, as light Rashi, according to Rashi, which is limud al derech hapshat, learning and understanding the pasuk in its simple meaning, kemen yeh up learning mezainis bana from mezainis ishtai. You could learn out the fact that the master has to feed the sons from the fact that he has to feed the wife. Is nicht verstandig. So the question is, was darf man haben noch a limud von dem pasuk be Parshas Seinu? As Rabbi is chayv im zaynis banav. If that's the case, that Rashi already told us in Parshas Mishpatim, that it's understood from the pasuk there that the master has to feed both the wife and the children, why is the Torah repeating this obligation again over here that the master has to feed the children? To me, is noch größer. The question on this is even stronger. Rashi be Parshas Seinu is medayik b'lashaynai, elo mikan she'Rabbi chayv b'mezainis banav. Rashi is very clear with his words, stressing that we learn from here specifically, this is the source, that a master has to feed the children as well. Nitvi in Parshas Mishpatim, wo sagt im Lashon magid HaKosov. In Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi does not emphasize that the source is here. He just simply says the pasuk is telling you this point. So Rashi is madgish. Rashi is stressing as the limud is mikan dafke. The source for the fact that the master has to feed the children of the slave is from here, unit von an ander art, and not from any other source. If so, the question here is, as the zwei pirushe Rashi zenen bestira zelazeh. The Rashi of Mishpatim and the Rashi here contradict each other, because in Parashas Mishpatim, Rashi adds that the master has to feed the children, meaning that there's already a source that's understood from the pasuk in Parashas Mishpatim that the master has to feed the children. And then here Rashi says, Mikan. We learn it only from here, from the pasuk in our Parsha, that the master has to feed the children. Okay, so as you see, the Rabbi here is addressing and contrasting the Rashi of our Parsha, where the Torah says that the master has to feed the children. We learn from the pasuk that the master feeds the children, and the language of the way Rashi quotes it and explains it here, and the Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim, where the pasuk says that the master has to feed the wife, and the way Rashi brings it there. So what's the difference between these two Rashis, and that there should not be a contradiction? We'll understand all this by prefacing another thing that you can point out here in the words that Rashi chooses. Rashi begins in his question on the pasuk, Im hu nimkar, if he, the slave himself, was sold. B'lashon nifal, the term nimkar is talking about the outcome, the fact that there's a sale that applies to him, meaning that he is sold. On days, but then Rashi concludes when he speaks about the children, Banav mi machran, b'lashon poel, or b'lashon poel. When he speaks about the children, Rashi uses the expression, the children, who is the one that actually sold them? So here, Rashi is addressing the one that's doing the action. And Rashi is asking, who is the one that actually sold them? So the question is, hat Rashi gedacht nutzen demselben Lashon bei beiden? Rashi should have used the same expression regarding the slave himself that's sold, and regarding the children that are sold. Either Rashi should use the expression im hu nimkar banov mi nimkuru or nimkarim. If he is, it's possible for him to be sold, talking about the outcome, talking about the very possibility that he should be sold. That's the expression used regarding the Eved himself. So Rashi should use the same expression. The children, is it possible for them to be sold here? Oder, or Rashi could use an expression, imhu machar atzmai, if he sold himself, addressing the one that actually sold, that if he did the action to sell himself, banov mi machram. So the children, who exactly is the one that sold them? So Rashi should use the same language regarding who and regarding banov. Why does Rashi switch the expression? The pel in them is noch gresse, the wonder in Rashi's words is even greater. In Gemara is take the lashon imhu nimkar banov mi nimkarim. In the Gemara, the language that's used is, if the children are sold, so who's the one that sold, if he is sold, if the slave himself is sold, who's the one that sold the children? And Rashi uses the term nimkarim, addressing the outcome, the fact that they're in a situation where they're sold. On Rashi is mishana from the lashon, and Rashi is switching from the expression that says in the Gemara, on zag banov mi machran. And Rashi rather says, the children, who is the one that did the act of selling them? So it's a big wonder, the fact that Rashi not only is switching the wording here from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence, but he's switching from the way the Gemara says it seemingly correctly. So the answer is as follows. Of course, the Gemara says it correctly, according to the halacha, the way it is in Gemara. And Rashi words it the way it is, according to Pshuta Shel Mikra. According to the halacha in the Gemara, a father cannot sell his son, which is a cotton, a child, under bar mitzvah as a slave. If you learned up from pasuk, as learned from the pasuk where it says, if a father will sell his daughter, and from this we learn, ha'ish meiches bitoi, a man could sell his daughter, that's under bas mitzvah, a katana, a child, ve'ena meiches b'nai. He can't sell his son into slavery. Und der Fahr nutzt die Gemara der Lashon Banav Minim Karim. The children, is it even possible that they find themselves in a situation that they're being sold? There's no possibility for them being sold. Nim Karim means Tziden werden sie bechlal verkauft. This whole entire concept or situation of them being sold isn't impossible by them because a father cannot sell a son. That's the expression of Nim Karim, talking about the outcome, the situation of them being sold. However, according to the simple reading of the psukim regarding an eved, when you read the pasuk that says a father that sells his daughter as a maid, you can't learn from it that it's only a daughter that can be sold and not a son. The fact that the Torah chooses to speak about a father selling a daughter is not so that you should deduce from this that it excludes a son. It's because the Torah here wants to tell you specific halachas that are only relevant for a maid. On the far steht bitoi, so therefore it speaks about the daughter. Aber euch benoi kann verkaufen, but even a son, a father could sell. Was is nitog kein tam al derech hapshat, because in the simple pshat of the pasuk there is no reason to machalik sein zwischen bitoi and benoi, to make any distinction between the ability of a father to sell a daughter or a son. As bide kann verkaufen und nit benoi, to say that a daughter you can sell and not a son. On the high time, it's for this reason is Rashi mishane von loshen ashas. So Rashi switches from the expression it says in the Gemara. Und sagt nicht, mi nimkarim. Rashi does not use the expression, how is it even possible for them to be sold? Nimkarim referring to the outcome, the situation of them being sold, that it's not at all possible regarding a son. Nor mi machran. Rather, Rashi uses the expression, who is it that did the act of selling them? Al derech hapshat, because in the simple understanding of the pasuk, a son or the sons can be sold. The shaila is nor mi machran. Who is it that sold them? That's why Rashi switches and uses this expression different than the Gemara, because in Rashi's opinion, in the pshat of the pasuk, just like a father could sell the daughters into slavery, the father could sell the sons into slavery as well. That's one point that we see here clearly in the expression of the words of Rashi. Now, based on this, we can go forward in understanding what Rashi means when he says the expression, the question that he asks, Im hu nimkar. Why does Rashi preface those words, if he is sold? Now we can understand what is the extra words that Rashi says here im hu nimkar, if he himself is sold. Rashi sind schwer nit nur die Wörter u bana vimai. What's bothering Rashi here in the pasuk is not only the extra words of bana vimai, that the sons are leaving the master with him. That what are the sons doing here? They're not slaves, so why are they leaving? What's bothering Rashi is also the extra word that it says here, who, that he is leaving. Was the father zamaitik euch dem word in dem dibra maschel, as we see from the fact that this is what Rashi is bothered by, because Rashi brings the word who as well in the quote in the dibra maschel of the pasuk. The lachayre, because the question here seemingly is the word who in pasuk ibrik? The word who in the pasuk is extra. Es steht doch v'yatsa mimach. The pasuk says that the slave leaves from you, from the master. Hat gedarft stehen v'yatsa meimach ubana vimai, that the slave leaves from you with his sons. Favash steht euch who. So the question is, why does the pasuk add again after it says that he leaves, that also repeating who that he leaves? That's the question that Rashi is coming to address, not only the words of bana vimai, what are the sons doing in slavery? So now one would now want to maybe explain the extra word who in the pasuk can say as b'pashasenu that in our pasha, when it speaks about the fact that here you have a yid that became very poor to the point that he has to sell himself into slavery to support himself, meint the Torah mit hu ubana vimai tzmeram zayin zwei mitziasen. By the Torah adding the word who and then writing the words ubana vimai, the Torah here is coming to hint that there are two possibilities of what's happening here. One is v'yatza me'imach, the slave, he sold himself into slavery and then he himself leaves. Retten fall wenn hat verkauft bloy sich allein als evet. So that's a situation where a person just sold himself into slavery. On who ubana vimai, and then when the pasuk says and repeats who, that he and his children leave, that wegen a fall when der yomach achicha is if weit, when this yid became so poor, bis hat zusammen mit sich verkauft euch seine Kinder banavub neisab, that he sold himself and his family, his children, his sons and daughters into slavery. Und if dem sagt Teire, as when es kommt Shnasa Yovel, and therefore Teire says, when the year of Yovel comes, v'yatza me'imach, one thing is, if he sold himself, he leaves. Or if the case is that he sold himself and his family into slavery, then hu ubana vimai, then he and his children will also leave at the year of Yovel. That's how you would understand the pasuk. And again, this is all based on the way that Rabbi explained before, that according to Rashi, in the pshat of the psukim, a father has the ability, the right to sell his sons and daughters into slavery. So maybe here when it says hu bana vima, it actually means that this is the case where the father sold himself along with his sons into slavery. It's this interpretation of the pasuk that Rashi comes to negate with the extra words where he says im hu nimkar, if he is sold into slavery. And what Rashi is saying is, Bishleime hu, it's understood when it says the hu in the pasuk, steht in pasuk wegen im beferish v'nimkalach. So the pasuk says, v'nimkalach, that he sold himself to you. Aber banav mimachran, the children, wo steht in pasuk as er verkauft? Where does it say in the pasuk that they were ever sold? As the pasuk soll danach erzählen wegen Yitziel lecheres, that now the pasuk should come to tell you that there's another option of what's going on here, that the children were sold together with the father, he sold himself with his family, and now they're going free. So Rashi is here pointing out that maybe in the words of the pasuk here, you may want to divide it, that there's who, and then there's actually me'imach, where the slave is sold himself, and then there's hu ubanav, which is when he sold himself with his family. But from what it says earlier in the psukim, we don't ever see that it's addressing such a situation. It only addresses when he sold himself into slavery. Where do we find that the pasuk spoke about a situation where he sold his children into slavery as well? That's what Rashi is negating when he says im hu nimkar. Yeah, we find he was sold, but we don't find that the Torah spoke about that the children were sold. In Parshas Mishpatim, where steht v'yatze ishtei imai. Now this is not the case when Rashi is addressing where the pasuk says that the wife goes free. On dem word hu, and there the Torah does not repeat and add the word hu. Hat nit Rashi was zu bringen dem Lashon von Rab Shimon im hu nimkar. There's no reason for Rashi to quote the expression of Rab Shimon of im hu nimkar to come and clarify the way he does over here as explained, because over here Rashi wants to make it clear that you can't say that the Torah is speaking about two different situations. Then and Rashi, so now Rashi comes and answers this question that basically, if we can't answer that the Torah by writing me'imach and then writing hu ubanov, that it's talking about two different things, so then the question remains, what is hu and what is banav me'imai doing here? So Rashi answers, Elamikan sherabi chayav b'mezainis banav. From here, the Torah is coming to teach that a master is obligated to feed the children as well. As mit hu ubanav imai, when the Torah writes these extra words of both hu, which is extra, and ubanav imai, retnit the Torah v'gni yitzia l'chayris. The Torah is not coming to address just simply that they go free. Nor wegen dem din from mezainis. Rather, the Torah is coming to tell you the halacha of the master, his obligation to feed. In welcher Rabbi is mechuyev that the master is obligated. Regarding that obligation, the children are together with the slave in the possession of the master. That's the intention of the pasuk. So this obviously answers why the Torah is saying banav imai, but this will also answer why the Torah here says hu. That's what Rabbi explains. Bald, as in dem chiyuv mezainis von unser pasuk is da a chiddush oich legabe dem evet gufe kidlekaman siv zayin. So now, since we understand that the pasuk here is primarily coming to address the obligation of the master to feed the children and the Eved himself, and there's something novel here about the obligation of the master, not only regarding the fact that he has to feed the children, but also regarding the fact that he has to even feed the Eved himself, as will be explained in Siv Zayin. So the pasuk, nit nor banav imai. Therefore, the pasuk says not only that he has to feed the children, the chiyuv of mezainis is banav, nor oichu. It also adds the word hu, the chiyuv of Rabbi to speisen dem Eved. It's repeating and telling us the obligation, or it's really not a repetition, it's coming to teach us here this obligation that the master has to feed the slave himself. Because there's something unique in the chiddush of this obligation that the master has. So what is that chiddush? What's unique that we learn in our parsha, that the master has to feed not only the children, but even the fact that he has to feed the Eved himself is also something new. So we already seemingly had this point in Parshas Mishpatim, where it says that the master has to feed the slave and the wife along with the slave, and even the children, as Rashi mentioned there. So what's new in our parsha? That it says that he has to feed the slave himself and the children. So here in Sivav, the Rebbe will explain the distinction. Then Chelek von die zwei psukim, the Mishpatim or the Parsha Seinu. The difference between the two psukim that addresses this point about the master feeding the slave and the children, or the wife as well, the way it's in Parshas Mishpatim, and the way it's brought in our Parsha. Hat schon Rashi gesagt in Parshas Mishpatim. Rashi already addressed this point in Parshas Mishpatim that we're not speaking about a person that was sold into slavery in the same way. As die Parsha von Eved Ivri dort red wegen an Eved was machru bezden begnevasei. In Parshas Mishpatim, it speaks of an Eved that was sold into slavery because he stole money and he didn't have anything to pay. So therefore the Bezdin then sells him into slavery as a mode of payment for his Gneva. Mashenke in the Parshas Eved Ivri in unser Sedre, but over here, the Parsha of Eved Ivri in our Parsha, here it's speaking about a person that became so poor that he himself is selling himself into slavery to support himself. As the pasuk here says in the beginning of the Parsha, that your brother became poor and he sells himself into slavery to you. Now the phone kommt heraus a chiluk ikri in the gather achiyov von dem Odin zu geben mezeines leishtoi bana von dem Evet. From this, there's a fundamental difference that we can see in the definition of this obligation of a master to feed not only the Evet himself, but also to feed the wife and the children along with him. What's the difference? When one is sold by the Bezdin against his will, it's logical to say, as Bezdin, that since the Bezdin is forcing him away from his family and forcing him to be sold into slavery, so it's the Bezdin's obligation to provide the needs of his family. Das heißt, so therefore what this means is, as das was Torah is mechayev dem Adam b'mezainis ishtay, the fact that the Torah obligates the master to feed the wife is not to leave the teyeles was the Adam hat, durch dem was ishtay shel eved, is leben dem eved, So it's not, the point here is not the fact that now the master himself gains by feeding the wife of his slave, because now the slave has his wife with him, und sie ist eine Kenegdei, she can support and help the husband, und tut für ihm alle Malachas she'isha baila, she'll do all the various different works that a wife does for a husband, and therefore this will give the master more benefit of work that he can get from his slave when he has the wife with him. It's not the point, it's not the fact that the Adon is feeding the slave is not as far as the relationship that there is between the slave and the master as a benefit for the master. Not rather, since here we're talking about a slave that's being forced and sold into slavery by the Bezdin, das ist Adin of Bezdin. This is the obligation that lies upon the Bezdin. They have to see, they have to take care of all the needs of the wife, usually the husband takes care of this. So therefore the Bezdin makes it clear with the master that's acquiring the slave as that he has to provide the needs of the wife, to feed her as well. That's when it comes to the slave that's being sold into slavery in Parshas Mishpatim. Ubemele is moving bepashtos. If this is the case, that the basis of the obligation to support and feed the wife is because it's the Bezdin forcing this man into slavery, tearing him away from his family, so therefore Bezdin is not going to leave his family stranded, and therefore Bezdin will make sure that the master will take care of the wife. So it's simply understood as Ma'adoch Bezdin Bavarin Mezaynes Ishtay. If Bezdin takes care of the food and the needs of the wife, was sie kann gehen arbeiten und bespeisen sich. She's able, as the Gemara says, go and work and feed herself and support herself. She has that option. Is the koshken v'kavachayme definitely as Bezdin muz bavaran and mezaynis banav aketanim. The Bezdin will take care of the food needed for the children and the ketanim, the young children that can't support themselves. Was kennen et arbeiten and they can't go and work. And the father is Rashi Moisef mezaynis ishtay ubanav. So therefore Rashi there in Parshas Mishpatim actually adds that yes, it's like a true. That it's understood that together with the wife, the master has to feed the children as well. Because otherwise you're left to wonder what's going on over here. If the reason why the master has to provide for the wife is because the Bezdin makes sure that you're going to take care of the wife, that you shouldn't be left stranded because they're forcing the husband into slavery, why aren't we mentioning the children? So therefore Rashi adds, in fact, yes, that's true. Self-understood that the same applies to the children as well. That's the slave that is being forced into slavery by the Bezdin in Parshas Mishpatim. Which is not the case when we come to our parsha, where it talks about a slave that is selling himself into slavery. Was the mechira is midas b'rotzen shneim. Here he's selling himself willingly with his knowledge and with his agreement to be sold to this master. Nit verbunden mit Bezdin, has nothing to do with the Bezdin getting involved here. Hat nit Bezdin was zu mischen sich. So therefore, there's no reason why Bezdin should intervene. To obligate the master to feed the wife and the children. And if the modern is nicht shaykh kin chiyuv zum mefarer sein mishpachas ha'eved, and on the master, it's not possible to place on him this obligation to feed the family of this eved. If it's not part of the agreement when the eved sells himself to this to this master. Sie haben doch kein Scheiches nicht zu ihm. They have no relation to the master. As soll sein Mechoyev, sie zu speisen. That he should have an obligation to feed them. If so, you would say, as by Meicher Atzmai, darf der Eved bazogim mizaynis banov. You would say that the master is obligated only to take care of the food of the children. Oder sie sind wie alle aniyim, wir sind in Stadt. Or we can say that the master's obligation towards the children of this father that's now sold to him as an eved is no different than any other poor people that there are in the city that you also have to contribute tzedakah to come and support them. So you would either say that in this case the eved himself, that is, just make sure I said it correctly before, the eved himself should have to provide for his own children. There's no reason to obligate the master for this. Or even if the master has to get involved, no different than what he has to do to support any poor people in the city. And therefore the Torah here comes and tells you a new halacha that we cannot understand of what it says in Parshas Mishpatim. Ubanav imay. Mikan sherabe chayev v'mezainis banav. The Torah here writes that he leaves together with his children. The Torah here, Mikan, is teaching you a new thing, that even when an Evet sells himself into slavery, the master will be obligated to take care of his children. This is a chiddush din b'Torah. This is a novel idea that the Torah here says, as a fila by meicher atzmai, even if he sells himself and there's no specific agreement that he's going to be feeding the children, is Rabbi chayev v'mezainis banav. The master is obligated to feed the children. So this is not a repetition of what it said in Parshas Mishpatim, even though in Parshas Mishpatim Rashi already said, Banov, that it's understood that the master has to feed the children, but that's in the case where Bezdin is forcing him into slavery. Here we're talking about when he sells himself. If not for the Torah being mechadish this, there's no reason to say that it's the master's obligation to feed the children. Damit, that man euch verstehen, was the pasuk is madgish, hu ubanavimai. With this we could also understand why the pasuk adds the word of hu together with banavimai here, weil in dem fall from meicher atzmai, because here, regarding the slave that sells himself, is euch das, was der evet bakut mezainis von Rabbi Yachidish. So actually, even the very fact that the slave himself gets fed by the master is also a novel idea that the Torah is telling us here that we don't learn from anywhere earlier. Why is this? Says da an art zu sagen. There's room to say, as der Adon is nit mechuyev zu geben dem Evet kemezainis, that the master is not obligated to feed even the slave himself. Because one could say as follows: was soll sein mechuyev zu geben dem Evet mehr wie viel mot abgerät lechatchile as der Zolten for sein Avdus? Why should he be obligated to give or to provide anything for the slave more than the agreement of whatever he's paying him for the work that he does? He's getting paid, and let him take from that money and feed himself, take care of himself. That was the agreement. So he has now funds to take care of himself. There was no additional agreement that he's going to be fed by the master. And obviously and definitely there's room to say, as der Adon is yetze mit geben dem Eved lechem tzar amayim lachatz, that the master can just do the minimal of providing the slave with just some basic bread and some water, as der Eved zal haben koyach zu arbeiten, that he should simply have the strength to do the work. If you want him to do the work for you, you have to at least give him this basic food to be able to work, but not to provide for him anything more. So the very fact that the master has to feed the slave is something that not necessarily should be an obligation. And therefore the Torah specifically over here tells us hu ubana vimai, that he is leaving his master along with his children, as Rabbi is chayev b'mezaisav al derech haragel, that the master has to feed him and he has to feed him properly, and therefore the Torah is adding the word hu, because even the very fact that he's feeding him is also a chiddush of the Torah that we understand only here from these extra words. So that's the explanation of what Rashi here says in our parsha. We now understand the introduction of imhu nimkar. What's bothering Rashi over here is the extra word of hu in the pasuk. And Rashi is coming to explain that we find that the master was sold, that the slave was sold, but we don't find that the children were sold. And Rashi explains that we're addressing feeding both the slave himself and the children, because in this case, since he sold himself into slavery, both that the master has to feed the slave and that he has to feed the children is a chiddush. And that's what the Torah is telling us here. Now, coming back to Rashi and Parshas Mishpatim, Malpi Anal is move on. Based on this, we understand was Rashi with Parshas Seinu is nit meisef ishtay. Why Rashi in our parsha does not add that the master also has to feed his wife. Al derech v'yer meisef banav in Parshas Mishpatim, similar to what he does in Mishpatim, where Rashi says that the master has to feed the children. And as the Rebbe explained before already, that there in Mishpatim, it's obvious that if you have to feed the wife, you definitely have to feed the children as well, because the case there is when the slave is being forced into slavery, so it's a Bezdin's obligation to take care of his family. Here though, when Rashi talks about the Eved that sold himself into slavery, and Rashi says that the Torah is telling you that the master is obligated to feed the slave himself, even though it's not an explicit part of the agreement, and he's also obligated to feed the children. But here, Rashi does not add that the master is obligated to feed the wife. And the reason is, because in the simple pshat of the pasuk here, it doesn't say anything about what the status with the wife is. Does she get fed by the master or not? The Torah does not say anything explicitly about this, and just thinking about this logically, you can say in various different ways what the halacha should be about this. And the Rebbe specifies, Kemen mikan from bezoines banov nit uplernen auf bezoines ishtay. Over here, when it comes to one that sold himself into slavery, and we're learning from here that he has to feed his children, you can't compare and say that if that's the case, then probably the same applies to the wife, that the master should feed the wife. There's no comparison. Because Meken Zagin, one could say, as das was Rabbi Chayv is banov, the fact that the master is obligated to feed the children, even though there's really no reason why he should be obligated. The slave is selling himself into slavery. No one's forcing him into this. But the Torah here nevertheless obligates the master to feed the children. Is nar val the Torah hat rachmanas of the kinder was kann sich allein nicht besorgen. It's simply the Torah's compassion on these children that can't take care of themselves. So the Torah obligates the master to take care of them. Whereas when it comes to the wife that could feed herself, as mentioned before, the Gemara says she can get a job and feed herself. Is Rabbi von So therefore the master is not obligated to feed her. In this case, when the slave sells himself. Gam yesh loymar. Also, it could be said in this case, as oich l'shittas Rashi b'pirushi ala Torah, that also according to Rashi, in the way he explains things here in the Torah, is Rabbi chayv mezonos ishtay afilu b'amoichar atzmai. There's room to say that maybe the master is obligated to feed the wife, in this case when a slave sold himself. And that is, vibal deroden hotatayeles from them was eishes eved, this is mit eved. As mentioned before, since the master has a benefit from the fact that the wife will be together with the slave. Kanal Sivav, as mentioned earlier. The Mele is menastam der Odne sich melachatchile mischayev zu speisen here. So therefore, it should sort of be self-understood that when he buys a slave, he doesn't want to separate him from his wife. He's going to have a compromised slave. So it's part of understood that part of the agreement here is that he's obligating himself to serve or to feed his wife as well. So as you see, we can say logically maybe that he is obligated. Aber Kanal, however, as mentioned before, das ist ein Inyan, das ist nicht ein Inyan, was man lernt ab from Banov. However, this discussion, whether the master is obligated to feed the wife or not, is not something that we can learn from what it says in the pasuk that Banov, that he has to feed the children. From from this that it says that the master has to feed the children when they're katanim, the master has no benefit from them. That's not the basis of why the master has to free them. As mentioned before, that's because of the compassion of the Torah upon them. The reason why the master is feeding the children is not because it's sort of self-understood that it's part of the agreement. So from Banov, we can't compare to the case of Ishtay. The svara we said before that maybe this is part of the agreement is not being learned from Banov. It's just a svara. Possibly this is the case. Further, the Rebbe says we could actually maybe approach this differently and say, perhaps we could say, as melent is up from achru bezdin, blois dem prat. Maybe this detail regarding the wife that has to be fed. Here we're talking about one that sold himself into slavery, but maybe this detail we could learn out from the case when Bezdin sells a slave into slavery. As men rechnet sich nicht damit, was sie können sich allein speisen. We see there that the Torah does not say, well, she could feed herself, and Bezdin is machriach dem Odin zu speisen her, and the Bezdin still obligates the master to free her. So maybe we see that the Torah does not want to rely on the fact that she can get herself a job. So this detail is something that maybe we could learn out from the Machru Bezdin. Similar by one that sells himself into slavery, as der Odin muzir geben mitzaynis mitzad teyeles was hot finir. So we could say that maybe the master should be feeding her, and that's because of the benefit that the master himself has, and this is part of the agreement. Kann sich nicht pateren mit der Teine, als soll sich allein speisen. And he can't say, no, I'm exempt of feeding your wife, that is, because she can feed herself. Because we see by Machru Bezdin that there we don't rely on the fact that she can feed herself. So maybe this detail is learned from Machru Bezdin. So as you see here, we have three different ways of approaching this regarding the status of the wife. In a case of Macha Atzmai, when a person sells himself into slavery, is the master obligated to feed the wife as well? So since this is not something that's learned from what the pasuk does clearly say, that the master has to feed the sons, so therefore Rashi leaves that open. He doesn't mention anything what the halacha actually is regarding the wife. After all of this, there's still something that a sharp student can ask as follows. As the Rebbe many times says, when Rashi quotes a name that is the source of the pshat that he brings, it's because Rashi wants you to look further into who this is that said the statement in order to answer a deeper question that may come up. And the question is as follows. Sof avos is the Radon chayavim is banav. In the end, the question remains, in our case, when a person sells himself into slavery, why is the Torah obligating the master to feed the children? He has no relation with them, he's buying a slave. And he has no benefit from them. Was ist schuldig, als hat sich verkauft zu ihm als Eved? Why is he guilty for the fact that this father is doing something maybe so irresponsible and he's selling himself as a slave? As soll sie müssen besorgen. That it should be the master's responsibility to take care of them. The slave should make some kind of arrangement if he's going to do such a thing. Dinam darf sein, wie alle andere Aniyim, was in Stadtkanal. Are you going to say, well, there's poor people. The Torah has compassion upon these poor people. Well, so there's other poor people in the city as well. And the halacha of the children should be no different than any of the other poor people in the city, where there's an obligation of the people of the city to give tzedakah and to provide for them. Why is the Torah creating a special obligation and placing it upon the master to feed them, that is? Is Rashi, the Merames, them Teretz, durchbringen dem Shem Balamayim Rab Shimon. So Rashi hints an answer to this by quoting this statement here in the name of the one that said this, Rab Shimon. Was the Shitasai is das verstandig. According to his opinion that he has elsewhere, this is understood. Rab Shimon Beichai sagt in the Sechte Baba Basra. Rab Shimon Beichai says in the Gemara in Baba Basra, Kol she'ene maniach ben le'yoshai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu malei olav evra. One that does not leave a son in this world that will inherit him, Hashem is filled with anger upon this person. In other words, the opposite of joy is expressed by Hashem in a situation where a person leaves the world without a son. If you look closely into the expression that he says, it's understood as this is not discussing here a situation where a person was guilty of not fulfilling the mitzvah of having children. Nor rather what he's addressing here is the fact that there's no son that will take the place of the father to inherit him. When a person leaves a son that will inherit him, is das Geirem Hepech from Malayavra. So this causes above by Hashem something the opposite of anger, which is Simcha. It brings a joy by Meibishn, because there's a son in his place. So that when the person leaves this world, he's never really leaving his world because the son takes his place. When, however, a person leaves this world and there's no one in the world taking his place, so the person is, so to speak, really fully leaving the world. So that's when the Gemara says that it's the opposite of joy by Hashem. That's the statement that Rab Shimon Beichai says. So you see there from what he says the unique connection that there is between this child and the father. So according to what Rab Shimon Beichai says here, is the Adgoshe in Kinder Asel Zayin Ben Le'Yarshe. One of the things that we see highlighted with a child is that it's not just a child which is an independent entity in the world, but rather this is a child that inherits, which means Kom Tachasov. When the father leaves the world, the child takes his place. Der Av uben zen an ein hemshich, meaning the father and the son are really one existence. The father continues by the existence of the son in the world. They're considered to be one entity literally. And the son takes the place of the father. That's what Rab Shimon Beichai is teaching us in a case where when a person leaves a child in the world, Hashem is happy about the fact that he never really left. There's a child in his place. This is the explanation here as well, why a master is obligated to feed not only the slave, but he has to feed the children along with the father. It's not because there's any unique reason why the master has an obligation towards them. It's because of the relation that there is between the father and his children. You can't separate the father and his children. They're one entity. Just like the master has to feed the slave himself, so too he has to feed the extension, the portion of the father, which is the children. The children are not a different entity, not independent people, but they are an extension of the father. And therefore, according to Rab Shimon, it's understood why the Torah here says that the master is obligated to feed the children as well. With this we could understand sweeter and better the continuation of the pasuk here, and what Rashi explains regarding this pasuk. It says v'yatza geimer hu banav v'imageimer, that he and his sons leave the master, and it says v'alachuzas aveisav yashiv, and he returns to the inheritance of his father. Now, what's the meaning of achuzas aveisav? Eru banav zenen benidan zeh ein mitzias. What the pasuk here is saying when it says that he and his children return to the achuzah, to the place of the fathers, what the pasuk over here is saying is that regarding what we're discussing here, the father and the sons are one entity. And therefore the pasuk continues and says that the slave himself, going back to where he comes from, to his fathers, they're also one entity. And therefore, ultimately, he can't remain sold to his master forever. He goes back to his true entity where he belongs. He's a continuation and an extension of his father, that is, of the slave's father. So that's, you see over here, the one point that the pasuk continues with. And with this we could also understand sweeter and better. How Rashi here explains the words achuzas aveisav in the simple understanding of the pasuk. So Rashi says, "Val achuzas aveisav" does not mean actually the inheritance of the father. It means el kavod aveisav. He goes back to the place of honor with his parents. Why is Rashi saying that achuzah here means kavod? It's not the usual translation of that word. Because what Rashi is saying here is as follows. Just like you can't separate the slave himself from his children, and therefore the master is obligated to feed the father, the slave, with his extension, which is the children. So too you can't separate the Evet from his fathers. Und the far balachuzas aveisav means kavod aveisav yashuv. He goes back. We're not talking here about a property, an inheritance, or a place where he lives. We're talking about the entity of the father himself that the slave goes back to. And therefore Rashi says achuzah here means the kavod, the honor of the father, meaning the relationship of where this Evet belongs to be with his father. That's the theme that the pasuk here is saying regarding the obligation that a master has to feed not only the father but the children as well, which are an extension of the father. That's what we learn from the name of Rab Shimon ben Yochai. From the Inyanim Muflaim al Derech HaRemez and Pirush Rashi. From the wondrous ideas, as a hint that we can take from what Rashi here says when he quotes Rab Shimon. Der Inyan from Veren Verkauft als Evet is a Remez of an Inyan Agolus. This subject we're speaking about, a slave that sells himself into slavery, is a hint for the situation of Yidden in the time of exile. Zok the pasuk. What the pasuk here is saying, asai derav n'sai banav. It's both the father and the children. What the hint over here is, sai kaviyachol avinu sheb'shamayim, that both our Father in heaven, so to speak, on sai Yidden and the Yidden as well, v'zenen banal amakim, that are Hashem's children, zenen avek and galus, have been expelled into exile. Kemaime, Rab Shimon ben Yochai, as Rab Shimon ben Yochai himself also said, chavivin Yisrael lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Yidden are cherished and beloved in front of Hashem, shebechol makim shegalu, wherever they go into exile, shchine imahem, the shchine comes along with them there. Und auf dem bringt Rashi Maimer Rab Shimon, was enthält noch a gresser oiftu. And here, besides what Rab Shimon says, that Hashem goes into exile together with his children, the Yidden, here, the statement of Rab Shimon that Rashi quotes here is actually makes an even greater point. It's not only as kol mokim shagoli Yisrael shchine iman, that wherever Yidden go into exile, the shchine is there in exile along with them. Not adarabah. On the contrary, here Rab Shimon says, "Im hu nimkar banav mi machram betmiyah." If the father is sold, how can the children be sold? What is he wondering about? When it comes to Hashem himself, Hashem, so to speak, can sell himself into an exile. Because Hashem is almighty, Hashem can be placed into an exile, and at the same time, while he's fully present there in this exile, he doesn't get affected or changed or restricted by the situation of exile. That's unique to Hashem's existence being almighty. So we understand what it means that Hashem is in exile. But when it comes to the children, how could the Yidden, Hashem's children, be sold into exile? If Yidden are placed into an exile, and the exile has control and dominion over their lives, if so, the fact that the Yidden are unique and we are the sons of Hashem cannot be expressed at all. because we're in exile, which doesn't allow the identity of the Yidden as children to be expressed. We can't be in exile and be totally under the control of Goyim, and at the same time be out of that restriction and still be the children of Hashem. So what does it mean that the children are going to be in Golus and retain that unique identity as children? And for Rab Shimon ben Yochai, so on this, Rab Shimon ben Yochai over here is answering us and telling us, as das was Banav zenen in Golus, the fact that the children, the Yidden, are in Golus, is es mer nit vi zeire on legabe zeire mezainis, tzarchi aguf. Their being in exile is only regarding and only in relation to the food, which is the needs of the body, the physical body. Ze gein adurich durich Golus. The needs physically that Yidden get from Hashem in the time of exile passes through the situation of exile, which means the Sara Medina. The minister above, the ministering angel, which is the source of the king or the president or whatever it may be, the government of the country, is the source of where the parnasa, all the physical needs of a Yid, passes through. So that's the exile that is regarding the physical needs of a Yid. However, the soul of the Jew is nit verkauft geworden in Golus chas v'shalom, was not at all sold into exile. Kepizgam ha'yidua, as the well-known statement that the Friediger Rebbe said in the name of his father, the Rebbe Rashab, nor unser gufim sind übergegeben in Golus. It's only our bodies that were handed over into exile. Aber unsere Neshamis hat man in Golus nit vertrieben. However, our Neshamis were not expelled into exile. Und in Shibud Malchi is not übergegeben, and it was not given over to any government that can rule or subjugate the Yidden, the souls of the Yidden in Golus. So that's what Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is clarifying, that yes, in fact, the children cannot be sold, the souls cannot be sold into Golus, because you cannot be in Golus and still be a soul, a child, a ben to Hashem at the same time. The son, the neshama by definition, cannot be in Golus. Thus, was this is given a churban, the fact that there was a destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, is as blois benegeya, the Gashmi is from Beis HaMikdash. This is all only in relation to the physical existence of the Beis HaMikdash, the eitzim va'avonim, the wood or the stones of the Beis HaMikdash. Regarding this, the guy has the power to burn and destroy it. But on the real, true Beis HaMikdash HaRuchni, the spiritual Beis HaMikdash of every Jew, and also the fact that Hashem dwells within the heart of every Jew, the Beis HaMikdash versus Da by Yed and Yidden, the Beis HaMikdash, which is the soul in the heart of every Jew, hat a guy kein shlit in it. No guy has no power or control over this. In them is Nechayach Ken Churban. Regarding the soul of a Jew, there's no such a thing as destroying or extinguishing the soul of a Jew. Kem and Meinen. So now if this is the case, once we understand this distinction between the soul and the body, as far as the relation to Golus is concerned, so one may think, as Benegeya the Mizaynis Akapanim, when it comes regarding his food, regarding the physical life, Tzarchi Aguf, the physical needs of the body of a Jew, Had Golus Yash Likt Yid. Over here, the exile does have control over the Yid. And if so, regarding the matters of his physical lifestyle, here he is in Golus, and therefore here in this aspect of his life, he can behave like any non-Jew as well. So this is another point we learn out from what Ashi quotes in the name of Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon tells us that the master has an obligation. He's simply fulfilling an obligation that's placed upon him to feed the children. Which means that Eibishter hat nur gewollt, als die Mizaynis von Yidden bis man Agalos sollen durchgehen dem Sara Medina. It was the will of Hashem in this time period of Galus that the sustenance, physically, the physical life of a Jew should pass through the channels of Galus, of the government, of the country, to come through this to the Yidden. It's not that the source of the sustenance of the lifestyle, of even the physical lifestyle of a Yid, comes from the government of the country. They are simply fulfilling an obligation, which is meaning Hashem that's providing through them. Aber der Sara Medina hat nicht kein Schum, der soll geben jeden sehen, oder nicht. But in reality, the government itself has no opinion or choice in the matter whether they should provide what the Jew needs to live physically or not. At his blois, kegarzen biyad achaytzev boy. He's simply like a axe in the hand of someone using it to chop down wood with it, that the axe does not make any decision of his own, has no significance on his own. So too, the channels of nature, of the government, that Yidden get their parnasa during the time of Galos, are simply fulfilling an obligation of the one that's using them, an obligation that's placed upon them to pass through this sustenance to the Yidden. Und noch mehr, furthermore, is mechuyev zu besorgen Yidden b'chol tzorcheim agashmiyim. He is obligated to provide for Yidden everything that they need physically. Ubemele, and therefore automatically it's understood, bakumen Yidden, the Yidden receive oich bisman agolos, even in the time of exile, bane, chaye, umezayne, children, life and sustenance, reviche, all in abundance, betoiv, hanire, v'hanigle, and open and revealed good.